It was late. I was standing in the kitchen, the only light coming from the faint blue glow of the microwave clock, and the silence of the house was almost deafening. In that moment I should have been preparing for bed or at least winding down after a long day. But instead, I was holding my husband's phone, my heart beating faster with each swipe of my finger as I scrolled through the message thread between him and her. A faceless username, a woman hidden behind a screen, but somehow she had wrapped him around her virtual little finger. Each message cut deeper. They were playful, flirtatious, and then crossed the line into something more. A line I never thought my husband, Sam, would cross. The realization hit me like a slap. He was in love with her. I couldn't even call her real. She was someone who only existed in the digital spaces, words on a screen, photos that probably weren't even hers. But it didn't matter to him. I read everything he'd written to her. About his day, his fears, even his wishes, as if he'd forgotten he had once shared all of those things with me. Every moment of intimacy between them pulled me further down into a well of betrayal and confusion. I had to stop myself from crying out loud, the kind of hollow scream that builds up in the chest and sticks there like a lump of lead. This wasn't something I could bear alone, and yet, I was the only one in that dark kitchen, the only one aware of my husband's second life. I dropped his phone back on the table, my hands shaking. It would have been easy to confront him right then, to turn on the light and let him see the rage and hurt simmering in my eyes. But something stopped me. If I confronted him, he'd likely just deny everything, dismiss it as a fantasy, or worse, he'd shut down, hiding behind the walls I now realized he'd been building for months. No, I couldn't confront him, not yet. I needed a way to make him see the damage he was doing, to turn the tables and remind him of the woman he'd promised to love. That night, I lay in bed beside him, my mind racing with possibilities. And then, somewhere between the silence and the glow of the streetlights outside, a thought emerged. What if I became her? Not literally, of course, but if I could enter his digital world, maybe I could find a way to reveal the depth of his betrayal. I could use his fantasy against him. The next day, while he was at work, I set up a new account. I used photos that weren't too polished, images I knew would fit his tastes, something a little mysterious, a little seductive, but not so glamorous that it would arouse his suspicion. I created a profile with just enough detail to make her seem real, with interests that matched his but weren't too close to mine, a playlist of songs he liked, and quotes that hinted at shared secrets and hidden desires. Her name was Sarah. Something about the simplicity of it felt just right. Then I waited. It took a few days to get his attention, but eventually he took the bait. His messages to Sarah began as cautious, polite exchanges about common interests. I crafted my responses carefully, dropping hints that would entice him further without giving away too much. I had to be someone he wanted to know, someone he'd feel connected to. Slowly, as he grew comfortable with me, his messages began to reveal pieces of himself I hadn't seen in months. He confessed frustrations, shared dreams, and opened up in ways he hadn't with me in so long. But now I was the one he was confiding in. I was the object of his affection and his secrets. Each message from him fed my dual emotions. A twisted sense of power mixed with a heart-wrenching sadness that he hadn't tried to speak this openly with me in reality. I knew the stakes were growing higher with each word we exchanged. But there was a perverse thrill in playing this role, in seeing how far he would go. With every message, I pushed him a little closer to the edge, slowly, subtly, encouraging him to fall even deeper into this false intimacy. And fall he did. Over the course of a month, Sam's attachment to Sarah blossomed. He shared more and more, and I carefully guided his attention, weaving stories that aligned with his needs and his vulnerabilities. I made him feel seen, loved, understood. Feelings he clearly thought were lacking in his life. And in return, he poured himself out to her, piece by piece, word by word, message by message. It was on a rainy Tuesday evening that he finally admitted to Sarah that he wasn't sure if his wife understood him anymore. He even hinted that maybe he didn't love her the way he used to. My breath caught in my throat as I read those words. There it was, in black and white. He was prepared to give up on us, on me, for someone he had never even seen face to face. My heart broke in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I swallowed back the tears. I couldn't afford to be weak now. I was almost there. I began to push for more. I asked him questions that drew out his vulnerabilities, encouraged him to express his fears, even planted the seeds of jealousy. I told him Sarah had once been betrayed by someone she loved and wasn't ready to be hurt again. The irony was as painful as it was bitterly satisfying. Here he was falling deeper in love with an illusion, convinced that I, his real wife, could never understand him. One night, I decided it was time to reveal the truth. I messaged him from Sarah, saying, "You know, I feel so close to you. I feel like I could tell you anything. But there's something you should know." His response was instant, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" he wrote. Sarah hesitated, sending a pause that would have his heart pounding. "I know things about you that you haven't shared. Things only someone very close to you would know. I am that someone." I watched as the three dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. He was typing, then stopping, unsure, probably confused, likely even frightened. After a few minutes, he finally responded. What are you saying?" I dropped the facade entirely. "Sam, it's me. Your wife. The woman you thought didn't understand you. The woman who thought you loved her enough not to betray her with a fantasy." The silence on his end was deafening. Minutes passed and I could only imagine him, staring at his phone, realizing that his secret world had crumbled around him. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I'd laid his emotional infidelity bare, stripped it down to its rawest, most painful truth, and for the first time in weeks I felt a sliver of power return to me. When he finally came home that night, he didn't know what to say. He stood there looking lost, ashamed, and I knew he was waiting for me to scream, to cry, to make it all real. But I didn't. I simply told him that I'd found my answers, and now it was his turn to decide what he wanted. He tried to apologize, stumbled over excuses, explanations, anything to justify what he'd done. But in that moment I saw him for who he was, a man who'd chosen an illusion over the reality of his marriage. It would take time to rebuild if we even could. But I had won back my strength, my clarity, and perhaps most importantly, I had shown him the devastating impact of his actions in the most unforgettable way. In the end, he wasn't in love with Sarah. He wasn't in love with me. He was in love with the fantasy he'd created in his own mind. And maybe that was the saddest part of all. But as he finally realized the depth of his betrayal, I could see the regret in his eyes. And I walked away, leaving him alone in that truth, just as he had left me alone in the dark weeks before. After that night, a strange quietness settled over our house. It wasn't a peaceful kind of silence, like the calm after a storm. It was an uncomfortable void filled with everything left unsaid. Sam tiptoed around me, doing his best to stay out of my way while I did the same, each of us skirting the other like ghosts sharing the same haunted space. His attempts to apologize had fallen flat, just empty words he'd uttered with a forced sincerity that couldn't convince even himself. Now, whenever he tried to speak to me, I simply looked through him, like he was the illusion he had tried so hard to chase. Days turned into weeks, each one blurring into the next. I kept waiting to feel something, a resurgence of anger, a renewed pain, or even the desire to scream at him, anything that would let me know I hadn't gone numb from everything he'd done. But nothing came. It was like a part of me had closed itself off, quietly and without permission, leaving me feeling hollow, like I was walking through my own life as a spectator. I tried to remember what it felt like to love him, to want to make him happy, but the memories felt dim, obscured by the shadows of betrayal he'd cast across them. But in that emptiness, an idea started to take root. I couldn't say exactly when it happened. Maybe it was on one of those endless, silent evenings when I watched him across the room, his face looking oddly unfamiliar as he scrolled through his phone, avoiding eye contact. I remembered the rush I'd felt when I'd created Sarah. The sense of control it gave me, the power to turn his lies back on him, to trap him in the web he'd spun. If that experience had taught me anything, it was that I didn't have to play the role of the wronged wife, waiting for him to decide if he wanted to fix our marriage. I could rewrite the rules. So I created a new profile. This time Sarah was gone, replaced by a woman with a different name, a new face, and an even more alluring mystery. She was bolder, more enticing, and perhaps most importantly, completely unreachable. I crafted her carefully, from the photos down to the interests that would appeal to Sam's growing insecurities, tapping into his need for validation, his search for meaning, the things he had tried and failed to communicate to me before. In this new version, Emma became the embodiment of everything Sam wished he could have but could never quite grasp. I knew him well enough to know that once he found her, he would be hooked, and the trap would be set. I didn't make it easy for him. This time Emma was elusive, distant, never giving him more than a hint of her interest. I watched as he fell for her, messaging her with the same eagerness I had once seen when he'd texted Sarah. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and I'd catch a glimpse of his excitement, a flicker of life that I hadn't seen directed toward me in so long. But every time he reached out to Emma, she'd pull back just enough, keeping him dangling on the line, desperate for more. I knew he was frustrated, maybe even questioning if he'd imagined her interest in the first place, but he couldn't let go. Not when she was just close enough to keep him chasing. The longer this went on, the more his real life started to unravel. He was distracted, missing deadlines at work, barely present when he was with friends or family. I could see the toll it was taking on him, his confusion growing as he tried to balance the fantasy he was chasing with the reality he was neglecting. He began coming home later and later, the weight of his own secrecy hanging over him like a shadow. Meanwhile, I played my role to perfection, smiling at him when necessary, keeping up appearances while watching the slow crumble of his facade. One evening he finally broke. We were sitting at the dinner table in our usual silence when he set his fork down, letting out a heavy sigh. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his eyes downcast, avoiding mine. I haven't been myself lately." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. He looked up, his gaze full of exhaustion and guilt. I think I need to figure some things out. About myself. About us." A part of me wanted to laugh, to let him know that I'd already seen everything, that his so-called confession was nothing but a delayed reaction to a lie he'd built himself. But I held back. Instead, I put on a concerned expression, leaning in slightly as if his words had struck me deeply. "What is it, Sam? You can tell me." He looked at me, almost pleading. "I think I've lost myself in something that isn't real. I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore." And in that moment I realized that he was truly lost. This wasn't just about a fake profile or his failed attempts at emotional escapism. He was genuinely struggling with himself, searching for something that he didn't even understand. I wondered if he'd ever understand it. If he would keep looking in all the wrong places, hoping that someone, somewhere would give him the answers he couldn't find within himself. That night after he went to bed, I logged into Emma's profile one last time. I could end it right here, let him see the truth in a way that would shatter whatever illusions he still clung to. But as I sat there looking at the screen, I realized that I didn't need to anymore. The power was already mine. I didn't need to twist the knife any further. He'd created his own downfall, and I no longer felt the need to watch him fall. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends, picking up old hobbies I'd abandoned over the years. I realized that I'd spent so much time trying to be the person he wanted that I'd forgotten who I was. For the first time in ages, I felt free from his expectations, his insecurities, and the resentment I'd harbored for so long. Sam, meanwhile, was a shadow of himself. He tried to rekindle our relationship, making gestures he probably thought would bring me back to him. But it was too late. I could see through every attempt, every half-hearted apology, every desperate plea for forgiveness. He was still searching, still hoping for someone else to complete him, never realizing that the emptiness he felt was one only he could fill. Eventually, I told him I needed space, and this time he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes hollow, knowing that he had lost something he could never win back. As I packed my things, preparing to leave, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. I'd spent so long trapped in his web of lies, but now, standing at the edge of my freedom, I felt nothing but peace. I wasn't walking away from him. I was walking back to myself. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew that no matter what he chased next, he would always be haunted by the one truth he'd never admit, that he was the one who had lost me, not the other way around. Leaving wasn't easy, and I won't pretend it was. I walked out that day feeling strong, determined, ready to reclaim a life I thought I'd lost. But the following days were quieter, heavier. I'd moved into a small apartment, just a few blocks away from where Sam and I used to live. It was strange watching the world go on without me, knowing Sam was just down the street, probably lying in bed, his face turned to the empty side of the mattress, wondering where things had gone so wrong. Part of me wanted to check on him to see how he was coping with this new reality, but I resisted. I knew that if I reached out, I would only be pulled back into the web I'd fought so hard to escape. The first month was a blur. I spent a lot of time alone, rediscovering myself in the absence of us. There were moments when loneliness crept in, whispering doubts in the quiet of my new apartment, reminding me of the comfort and familiarity of the life I'd left behind. But I pushed forward, letting myself feel the weight of those doubts, confronting each pang of regret until they dulled and faded. I kept busy diving into work, meeting old friends for coffee, rediscovering parts of my life I had abandoned in the years spent trying to keep Sam happy. And as the weeks turned into months, something remarkable happened. I started to feel whole again, like a broken vase slowly pieced back together, with cracks still visible but stronger, more resilient. The version of myself I was becoming was far different from the one Sam had known, and I found myself grateful for that. I was creating a life that was entirely my own, unshaped by his desires, his insecurities, or the weight of his expectations. Then out of nowhere came a message. My phone buzzed one Friday night, and I glanced down to see his name on the screen, that all too familiar name that, even now, sent a ripple of mixed emotions through me. My first instinct was to ignore it, to leave him in the past where he belonged. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the message. "Hey, I just wanted to check in. I hope you're doing okay." It was simple, just a few words, but I could feel the hesitation behind them, the uncertainty and quiet regret. For a long time I stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of all the pain he'd caused, of the nights I spent doubting myself, feeling like I was losing my mind. But I knew that wouldn't bring me any peace. I had already won back my power by walking away, and I wouldn't give it up by letting him drag me back into his mess. After a few minutes, I typed back a simple response. "I'm doing fine, thanks. I hope you are too." The conversation was as brief as it was polite, and for a moment I wondered if that was the closure we both needed. But a few days later another message came through. This time he was less guarded. "I miss you. I know I messed up, and I wish I could go back and fix things." Reading those words stirred up old feelings, the kind I thought I'd buried. But instead of nostalgia or regret, all I felt was a deep sadness for him. A sadness that he would never understand that it wasn't me he missed, but the version of himself he could only find through someone else. Still, I couldn't deny the pull of old memories, the way his words brought back fragments of the life we once shared. For weeks he kept reaching out, sending small messages, apologies, and half-hearted attempts to reconnect. And while I responded to some, mostly out of politeness, I could feel the distance between us widening with each exchange. He was desperate to repair what we had, but I could see that he still didn't understand the depth of the damage he'd caused. He wanted forgiveness, closure, maybe even a second chance. But I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who would wait around for him to make up his mind, to decide if I was worth fighting for. One evening he called. His voice was hesitant, softer than I remembered, and I could tell he was nervous, afraid of what I might say. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he started, his words careful, each one weighted with regret. "But I just needed to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. I've been thinking about it every day, and I realize now that I took you for granted." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. I could sense the sincerity in his voice, the pain he was grappling with, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. Maybe he really was sorry. Maybe he did finally understand what he'd lost. But I knew it wasn't enough. He had shattered something between us that couldn't be mended with apologies or good intentions. "I appreciate that, Sam," I said, my tone calm but resolute. "But I've moved on. I'm not the same person I was before, and I don't think I could ever go back to that." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear the weight of his silence, the realization that he had lost me for good. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. I wish things could have been different." And in that moment I felt a strange sense of peace. I had spent so much time waiting for him to understand, to acknowledge the hurt he'd caused, and now, hearing his quiet admission, I knew I could finally let go. "Me too," I said softly, and with that I ended the call. In the days that followed, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if a weight had been lifted, as if I had finally untangled myself from the last threads of our broken marriage. I no longer felt the need to check his messages, to wonder if he was thinking about me or regretting his choices. I had my life back, and for the first time I felt free to live it on my terms. I focused on building new memories, new routines, filling the empty spaces with things that brought me joy. I reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and even started dating again, though cautiously, knowing I still had some healing to do. And as the months passed, the memories of Sam faded, becoming distant fragments of a life that felt more like a dream than reality. One day, I ran into a mutual friend who told me that Sam had left town. He'd taken a job in another city, hoping for a fresh start. I felt a strange sense of relief at the news, knowing that his absence meant I could finally close that chapter for good. Years later, looking back, I sometimes think about the lessons I learned from that time. I realized that betrayal isn't always about infidelity. Sometimes it's about the slow erosion of trust, the quiet moments when someone drifts away without you even realizing it. But I also learned that there is strength in letting go, in choosing to walk away from a love that no longer serves you, even when it hurts. I may never know if Sam found what he was looking for, if he finally understood the emptiness he had tried so hard to fill with fantasies and lies. But in the end, that wasn't my burden to carry. I had found my own peace, my own happiness, and that was more than enough. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a comforting rhythm. I'd built a new routine, filling my days with work, friends, and small rituals that brought me a quiet sense of joy. The shadow of my past with Sam had receded so far that sometimes it felt like it had happened to someone else, as if I were remembering scenes from a movie instead of fragments of my own life. But every now and then, memories of Sam would flicker back unexpectedly, like a distant echo. They didn't carry the same weight they once had, but there was a lingering sadness there, a bittersweet reminder of everything I'd lost, and more importantly, everything I'd gained in the process. It was strange. In the quiet moments when I'd least expect it, I'd find myself almost grateful for the experience. That heartbreak had torn me apart, but in those broken pieces, I'd found parts of myself I'd never known before. One evening, I went out with friends to a new restaurant. It was a lively place filled with laughter, the soft clink of glasses, and the comforting buzz of conversation. I felt a sense of ease I hadn't felt in a long time, as if I were exactly where I needed to be. I ordered my favorite drink, laughing at a story one of my friends was telling when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone watching me. I turned slightly, my laughter fading as I realized who it was. Sam. He was sitting at a table across the room, half hidden by a plant, looking older, tired, almost out of place in the lively crowd. I hadn't seen him in over a year, not since he left town. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw something that made my heart twist. A sadness, a regret that he hadn't been able to outrun. I considered looking away, pretending I hadn't seen him, but something in his expression held me there. He seemed to debate for a moment before giving a small nod, acknowledging me without coming over. And with that, he turned his attention back to the people at his table, making it clear that he wouldn't disturb me. The rest of the night, I felt his presence in the background, a silent reminder of a life I'd left behind. But as the evening wore on, I found myself laughing again, losing myself in the stories and warmth of my friends, and by the time we were leaving, I'd almost forgotten he was there. Yet the encounter lingered in my mind for days. Seeing him again reminded me of the person I had been with him, the version of myself that was once so willing to settle for less, to ignore her own needs just to keep him happy. I felt a mix of pity and relief, thankful that I had grown past that place, and hopeful that he might someday do the same. Then one Saturday morning, as I was sipping my coffee, a message appeared on my phone. It was from an unknown number, but the words made it clear who it was. "Can we talk? Just once. I need to see you." I stared at the screen, the memories of our last conversation flickering back, and I felt a pang of hesitation. What could he possibly want to say now after all this time? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the silence continue, but a lingering curiosity crept in, and against my better judgment I agreed. We met at a small park near my apartment, a quiet place where the trees provided shade and a sense of calm. When he arrived, he looked nervous, his face lined with a weariness I hadn't seen before. He offered a tentative smile, and we sat down on a bench, a polite distance between us. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his voice soft, almost uncertain. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I needed to apologize. I don't think I fully understood the damage I caused until after you left." He paused, looking down at his hands. "You were right to walk away. I needed to lose you to see what I'd done. And I hate that it took that for me to finally understand." There was a rawness in his voice that surprised me, and I felt a mix of emotions rise up: anger, sympathy, even a touch of the old love that had once connected us. But I held back, letting him speak. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time trying to fill this void inside me, looking for something that would make me feel whole. But none of it worked. And in the process, I pushed away the one person who truly cared." His confession felt like a release, as if he were finally facing himself for the first time. I listened, not out of obligation, but because I could sense the sincerity in his words. He was no longer the man who had betrayed me, or the one who tried to manipulate my forgiveness. He was simply a broken person trying to make amends. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes full of sadness and an unspoken question. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I know I probably don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that." Ido. There was a long pause, a silence filled with the weight of everything we had been to each other and everything we would never be again. And then in that quiet I felt something unexpected. A softening, a release of the last remnants of anger I'd held on to. I had forgiven him, but not for him. I had forgiven him for me, to free myself from the bitterness that had lingered too long. "I've moved on, Sam," I said gently. "I don't regret the time we had, and I don't regret walking away. I think it was the best thing for both of us." He nodded, his gaze distant, as if he were finally understanding the truth I had found long ago. As we said goodbye, I felt an odd sense of closure, a feeling that our story had finally come to an end. I knew I would carry a part of him with me, just as he would carry a part of me, but our paths had diverged and I was at peace with that. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, as if a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. I threw myself into my new life with renewed energy, embracing the freedom and joy I had fought so hard to reclaim. And in the quiet moments when memories of Sam drifted back, they no longer held the same power. They were simply pieces of a story that had ended, a chapter that I had outgrown. Over time I found love again. Not a love built on illusions or insecurity, but one grounded in respect, honesty, and a shared understanding. It was different from what I'd known with Sam, quieter, deeper, and infinitely more fulfilling. I had learned to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to never settle for anything less than the love I deserved. Looking back now, I can see that my journey wasn't just about surviving betrayal. It was about rediscovering my own strength, reclaiming my identity, and learning that I was complete on my own. Sam's betrayal had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for growth, pushing me toward a life I never could have imagined. And in the end, I realized that the greatest act of revenge wasn't hurting him or making him feel my pain. It was thriving, finding happiness and fulfillment on my own terms, and knowing that no matter what happened, I had come out of it stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. And that freedom, hard-won and deeply cherished, was the sweetest victory of all. As my life moved forward, I noticed something new blossoming within me. A profound resilience that I hadn't known before. It was as if all the pain, the heartbreak, the confusion had become a foundation, something sturdy and solid beneath me. I carried it with me not as a wound, but as a reminder of what I had overcome. In the months that followed my encounter with Sam, I embraced a sense of adventure. I traveled, something I had always wanted to do but never had the courage for. I filled my life with new experiences, each one pushing me beyond the boundaries I had once thought were unbreakable. From wandering through the streets of Rome to hiking mountains I'd only dreamed of, I felt as if the world had opened up just for me, a gift in return for everything I had endured and let go of. In every new city, in every unfamiliar face, I saw reminders that my life could be as vast and varied as I dared to make it. But it was also in the small things, the quiet mornings with coffee and a good book, the laughter shared with friends over dinner, the peace I felt simply being on my own, that I found my greatest joy. I no longer needed the grand gestures, the constant reassurance, or the validation I had once sought so desperately from Sam. I had found all those things within myself. After a year had passed, I no longer thought of Sam with any lingering bitterness. I felt a distant fondness for what we'd once shared. But it was like a story from another life, as if I were remembering someone else's memories. Occasionally, mutual friends would mention him in passing, and I'd learn small updates about his life. He'd moved to a new city, found a job he liked, and had even started dating again. Each piece of news fell upon me lightly, like raindrops that left no mark, simply reminders that life had moved on for both of us. One night at a mutual friend's party, I met someone. His name was Luke, and he was warm, grounded, with a sense of humor that immediately put me at ease. We started talking, and there was a familiarity between us, a comfort I hadn't expected. He had a gentleness, an honesty in his gaze that felt like the very opposite of everything I had experienced with Sam. But the best part was that he didn't feel like a replacement or a way to erase the past. He was simply someone new, someone who saw me for exactly who I was, no pretense or expectation. Our connection was gradual, easy, like two rivers finding a way to merge naturally without rushing. Luke didn't push me to share details of my past, but he listened without judgment when I felt ready to tell him. He understood the journey I had been on, not because he'd been through the same, but because he respected my independence, my need to keep building my life even as we became closer. Over time, we created our own rhythm, a quiet intimacy that felt safe and genuine. Luke would take me out to places he knew I'd never been, little hole-in-the-wall cafes or forgotten trails along the coast, always encouraging me to see things from new perspectives. And for the first time, I felt truly valued, not for what I could give or do for him, but simply for being myself. Our love was steady, strong, not built on illusion or fantasy, but on a shared respect that had grown naturally between us. As our relationship deepened, Luke taught me that love didn't have to be a constant test, a roller coaster of highs and lows, or an exhausting game of guessing someone else's intentions. With him, there was no pretense, no need to compete for attention, and none of the nagging fears I had lived with for so long. It was freeing, like discovering that love could be as comfortable as it was exhilarating, as honest as it was passionate. One weekend, as we were walking along the beach, he looked over at me and smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made my heart feel both vulnerable and safe. "You know," he said, kicking at the sand, "I don't think I've ever met anyone as strong as you. It's like you're built from steel and kindness all at once." I laughed, brushing off his compliment, but I couldn't help feeling the truth in his words. I had grown stronger, tougher in a way that didn't harden me, but simply made me more resilient. And I had learned that this strength was part of my foundation, something no one could ever take away. In time, Luke and I made a life together, one that was built on respect and mutual support. We didn't rush, but allowed ourselves to grow alongside one another, each of us a complete person on our own, yet better together. It was a relationship that valued individuality as much as unity, and I felt myself healing in ways I hadn't realized were still possible. Through Luke, I learned to trust again, not just in him, but in myself and my ability to choose a partner who truly valued me. Years passed and life took on new rhythms, new milestones. Luke and I eventually married, a simple ceremony by the sea, surrounded by friends and family. I felt a joy I hadn't expected, a peace I hadn't known was possible. I was no longer defined by the wounds of my past. They were simply the steps that had led me to this moment, to a love that was as real and lasting as it was grounded in honesty. Now, looking back, I realized that my journey was never about revenge or proving a point. It was about finding my own strength, my own happiness, and understanding that sometimes, the hardest experiences are the ones that lead us to where we were meant to be all along. Sam's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything I'd known, but it had been a doorway to a life richer, fuller, and more meaningful than anything I could have imagined. Through all of it, I learned that love isn't about filling an empty space within yourself. It's about sharing your completeness with someone else. And I found that the most beautiful kind of love isn't the one that makes you lose yourself, but the one that helps you become more of who you already are. And now, when I think of Sam, it's with a quiet sense of forgiveness. He was part of my journey, a chapter that had shaped me but no longer defined me, In the end, he was just one part of a much larger story. A story that had led me, finally, to myself. As the years drifted on, my life with Luke became filled with countless small, beautiful moments that seemed almost ordinary in their simplicity. Yet somehow they added up to something extraordinary. There was a kind of magic in those quiet rituals. Our morning coffees on the balcony, the weekend trips to explore hidden trails, the way he would bring me flowers on random Tuesdays just because. The life I had once fought so hard to reclaim was now rich, fulfilling, and completely my own. Shared with a man who understood and loved every facet of who I was. One summer, Luke and I decided to buy a small cabin upstate, tucked away in the woods where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the gentle flow of the nearby creek. It became our sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the world, to unplug and simply be. Those weekends away were some of the happiest of my life, spent reading on the porch swing, hiking together, or cooking meals from whatever vegetables we'd picked up at the local farmer's market. In that space, I felt the deep, steady calm of a life that was both peaceful and grounded, the kind of peace I once thought was only reserved for fairy tales. Over time, Luke and I started talking about the future, about maybe raising a family in that very cabin one day. The thought both excited and frightened me. I had always been fiercely independent, and there was a part of me that worried about what motherhood might mean for my identity, for the life I'd fought so hard to reclaim. But Luke, as always, met my fears with patience, assuring me that whatever path we chose would be one we walked together, each step at my pace. Eventually, we welcomed a daughter into our lives. A tiny, curious bundle with Luke's gentle eyes and my stubborn spirit. She filled our world with a joy and light I hadn't known was possible. Watching her grow, her laughter echoing through our little cabin, I realized that she was a piece of both of us, a living testament to the love we had built. I could see the foundation we had worked so hard to lay reflected in her. Secure, loved, unafraid. And in those quiet moments when I watched Luke hold her, whispering little stories to her as she drifted to sleep, I knew that I had made it through the fire and come out the other side with something truly precious. Every now and then, as I rocked her to sleep on the porch, I would reflect on the journey that had brought me here. My past had faded like an old photograph, no longer vivid or painful, just a shadowed memory that had shaped me but held no power over me. I found myself grateful for every heartbreak, every disappointment, every tear I had shed, because they had been the steps leading me to this life, to this man, and to this little girl who now looked up at me with eyes that held the promise of a bright, beautiful future. One autumn, I received an unexpected message. It was from an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years, someone from that distant time when my life had been tangled with Sam's. She wrote to catch up, to see how I was doing, and at the end of the message she mentioned Sam in passing. "Did you hear? Sam's moved back to town. I thought you might want to know. I ran into him and he asked about you." Reading her words, I felt an odd mixture of surprise and curiosity, but the mention of Sam stirred no old wounds. Instead, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I still needed. Sam had been a part of my life, a crucial chapter that had helped shape who I was, but he no longer occupied any part of my heart or mind. Still, the fact that he'd asked about me made me wonder, was he seeking closure of his own? Was he still searching for answers he had never found? In a way, I hoped he had found some peace, that he had come to terms with the choices he'd made and had grown from them, just as I had. I imagined him somewhere in the city, living his life, perhaps reflecting on the things he'd learned from our time together. And while I had no desire to reconnect or reopen old wounds, I did feel a quiet sense of forgiveness, a wish that he too had found happiness and that he would remember our time together not as a source of regret, but as a lesson, just as I had. As the years went on, life continued its steady, comforting rhythm. My daughter grew, filling our world with a boundless curiosity, and Luke and I continued to build the life we had always dreamed of, simple, joyful, built on a foundation of trust and love. We taught our daughter to be kind, to be strong, to cherish her independence, and to never settle for anything less than what she deserved. I watched her growing up with pride, knowing that she would carry with her the lessons I had learned the hard way, and that she would walk her own path with confidence and courage. One evening, as we sat by the fire in the cabin, our daughter fast asleep in her room, Luke looked over at me and took my hand. There was a softness in his gaze, a depth of love that still took me by surprise even after all these years. "I'm so grateful for you," he said quietly, his thumb brushing against my hand, for this life we've built. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words brought a warmth to my heart, a reassurance that reminded me of how far we had come together. I squeezed his hand, feeling the strength of our connection, the bond that had carried us through so many moments, both big and small. As I looked into his eyes, I thought of everything we had been through, the love, the struggles, the sacrifices, and I knew that I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Our journey had been filled with twists and turns, but it had brought us here, to a place of peace and contentment that was as real and lasting as the mountains surrounding our little cabin. And in that moment I realized that I had come full circle. I had started as a woman searching for love, for validation, for a sense of belonging, but I had found something far greater. I had found my own strength, my own resilience, and a love that was rooted in truth and mutual respect. Now, when I looked back on my life, I no longer saw the pain or heartbreak. I saw a journey of growth, a path that had led me to the life I had always wanted. And as Luke held me close, the fire crackling softly beside us, I knew that I had found my forever, not just in him but in myself. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift of all. As I sat there, wrapped in Luke's arms, watching the firelight flicker across the walls of our cabin, I felt the quiet fulfillment of a life well lived. A life I had fought for, piece by piece, and had finally found. The shadows of my past were gone, replaced by the warmth and comfort of the present, and I knew that this love, this life was everything I had once dreamed of, but had never fully believed I deserved. I looked around at our cozy little cabin, at the photos on the walls that told the story of our years together, the laughter, the travels, the simple everyday moments that had woven a tapestry of shared memories. Our daughter's toys were scattered on the floor by the couch, her books piled up on the coffee table, and I smiled, thinking of her sleeping peacefully in the next room, safe and loved. My heart felt full, brimming with gratitude for every twist and turn that had led me to this place. For the first time in my life, I felt complete, not because of anyone else, but because I had finally found peace within myself. Luke's presence was a gift, a love that was steadfast and true, but it was my own journey, my own resilience, that had brought me here, to a life that felt both hard-won and deeply cherished. I leaned my head on his shoulder, and as we sat in comfortable silence, I realized that I had found something rare. A quiet joy, a deep contentment that didn't depend on the whims of another's affection or the need for validation. It was a happiness that was mine alone, grounded in the life I had built and the woman I had become. This was my happy ending, not because it was perfect or without challenges, but because it was real and because it was mine. The journey had been long, filled with heartbreak and hard lessons, but it had led me here, to a place of love, resilience, and a peace I hadn't known was possible. And as the fire crackled softly beside us, I closed my eyes, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready, and that I had everything I needed. I had found my home.